HMS Resolution was one of the later Revenge-class battleships, built as a more traditional battleship alternative to the somewhat hybrid Queen Elizabeth class. Although laid down in November 1913, wartime delays meant that she was launched in January 1915 and only commissioned into the fleet at the end of 1916, thus missing out at the Battle of Jutland, an encounter that her sisters Revenge and Royal Oak took part in, and Royal Sovereign only just missed out on, despite these latter two ships being laid down somewhat later than Resolution, albeit in royal dockyards as opposed to private ones. However, even freshly commissioned, she found herself in a world that was changing extremely rapidly, and in her brief wartime service she would see a number of substantial modifications. Above the waterline, this included more armour for the magazines, more anti-flash protection, and aircraft launching platforms atop the two super-firing turrets, along with a new, larger rangefinder for B turret. Below the waterline, large anti-torpedo bulges were also fitted to improve protection in this area, and so by the time peace came around, she rode higher in the water whilst displacing more than her original design called for. This high riding put her in good position for interwar modifications and improvements. Unfortunately, the new paradigm of naval warfare was decidedly faster than Resolution's 22 to 23 knot theoretical top speed, and although slightly older, the slightly faster Queen Elizabeths, which were also fractionally larger, were the ships that were primarily targeted for extensive refits, rebuilds and upgrades. Resolution, like many of her sisters, would instead receive only gradual and incremental improvements, mostly in the form of replacing some of the 6-inch and all of the older 3-inch guns with 4-inch anti-aircraft weapons and their associated fire control systems as they became available and evolved. During the interwar period, the ship served with other Revenge class in a squadron, first in the Atlantic Fleet, and then in the Mediterranean Fleet in the early 1920s, as a variety of international crises called for British responses, with the two main interventions being the ongoing Russian Civil War and the Greco-Turkish War. With matters somewhat calmed down, the squadron would return to the UK briefly, where Resolution accidentally ran over the submarine L-24, which was lost with all hands during a training exercise. Although the crew aboard Resolution did feel the impact, they didn't actually realise what had happened until they got back into port, noticed the dent on their bow, and then sometime later L-24 failed to check in. During the interwar period, the Revenges and Queen Elizabeths would always be in their own separate squadrons, but whether these were operating together or operating in alternate theatres, with one in the Mediterranean and one at home in the Atlantic Fleet, which was later renamed the Home Fleet, varied somewhat over the course of the 1920s. In the 1930s, more anti-aircraft guns in the form of modern replacement 4-inch anti-aircraft weapons as well as new octuple pom-poms were installed, somewhat balanced by the elimination of some of the underwater torpedo tubes, but despite a refit in the mid-1930s, Resolution was not fully modernised in the way that Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Renown were, and so War found her based in the Home Fleet but very much viewed as a second-tier capital ship. The most modernised member of the class was the Royal Oak, and U-47 soon brought that ship's career to an abrupt end. After some brief thought to using her to hunt German surface raiders, which itself ran into the rather obvious speed issue, she was instead assigned to convoy escort duties, where the fact that the German raiders would have to come to her negated much of her speed disadvantage, with her overall top speed having dropped to around about 20 knots or just under over the course of the interwar period. During this time, a disguised merchant ship stood in for her at Scapa Flow to confuse German aerial recon while she was at sea. As with all Royal Navy capital ships, she would receive more light and medium anti-aircraft guns, radar of various kinds, and specific to certain 15-inch armed vessels with unmodified gun mountings, supercharges to augment the range and power of her guns as war progressed. Her greater utility against targets that couldn't go anywhere fast was exploited by utilising her in the attacks on the French naval units at Mers el Kebir and then later at Dakar, where the Richelieu was waiting. This latter attack was something of a fiasco, since the French battleship was in port, any available radar set of the time was useless with background clutter, and poor visibility meant that after 3 days of trading shots, all there was to show for it was splinter damage on both sides, and a few hits on smaller British ships from coastal batteries. This all came to an end when a French submarine managed to get a torpedo into Resolution, which was only saved by those torpedo bulges that had been installed back in the First World War, damping the explosion just enough to allow her to stay afloat, despite the explosion still rupturing a boiler room and causing it to be flooded. Eventually making her way over to the USA for a refit via a number of other ports, her guns were given increased elevation, obviating the need to use superchargers, whereupon she was assigned to the Eastern Fleet and was present during the back-and-forth manoeuvres between Admirals Somerville and Nagumo in the Indian Ocean, before the campaign concluded with the Revenge class as a whole being pulled back to the western part of the Indian Ocean, where they would take up escort duties. However, by late 1943, with Axis capital ships on the decline and more modern Allied battleships coming online, there was less need for her services and she was put into the reserves, eventually becoming a training ship, with her guns being used to replace the worn-out weapons on other 15-inch armed ships, undertaking bombardment duties at the D-Day landings. One of these guns would eventually find its way to the front of the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on display to this day, whilst the ship itself would be sold for scrapping in 1948.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.